Did the COVID vaccine stop transmission of the virus?
That is a complicated issue. It was a lab leak, and I was parachuted into the CIA like Jason Bourne and told the CIA that they should really not be talking about a lab leak.
Did the National Institute of Health fund the potentially dangerous enhanced potential pandemic pathogens gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I would not characterize it the way you did. You said about 4 or 5 things, Congressman, that were just not true.
Well, we have emails to prove it.
Well, you don't.
You did sign off on these so-called scientific experiments. And as a dog lover, I want to tell you this is disgusting and evil. Do you think that's appropriate? Do the American people deserve to be abused like that, Mr. Fauci? Because you're not doctor, you're Mr. Fauci in my few minutes.
It's completely unacceptable to be able to deny Dr. Fauci, who's here, a respected member of the medical community, his title, and that's actually a personal attack on his character.
And I have instructed her.
He's not respected. You know that what this committee should be doing? We should be recommending you to be prosecuted.
Are all objections to COVID vaccinations ideological bullshit, Dr. Fauci?
No, they're not, and
Thank
that's
you.
not what I was referring to.
Well,
So I hear now you double Fauci.
Do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Dr. Fauci, February 1, 2020, you were on a call with Dr. Farrar, Dr. Collins, and other scientists regarding the potential that COVID-19 was engineered. Was CDC Director Redfield on that call?
No, he was not.
Okay. Dr. Fauci, you've said that you had to rely on virologists and evolutionary biologists regarding origins because you're not an expert. Is Dr. Redfield a virologist?
I believe he is. Well, let me just make sure we get the facts. After the investigations began about COVID, I was briefed by intelligence agencies about possibilities of there being activities going on in different laboratories. I was briefed by intelligence agencies.
Thank you. Did the COVID vaccine stop transmission of the virus?
That is a complicated issue because in the beginning, the first iteration of the vaccines did have an effect, not 100%, not a high effect. They did prevent infection and subsequently, obviously, transmission. However, it's important to point out something that we did not know early on that became evident as the months went by, is that the durability of protection against infection and hence transmission was relatively limited.
Dr. Fauci, according to the regulatory definitions, for example, in P3CO, that NIH applied to proposed research, did NIH ever fund gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China?
As you said, Congressman Ruiz, according to the regulatory and operative definition of P3CO, the NIH did not fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Dr. Fauci, in your opening statement, you attempt to distance yourself from your previous senior advisor, Dr. Moran's. You say that Dr. Moran's title was just made up, that he was not an advisor to you, and that his office was in a different building. So, Dr. Fauci, did Dr. Moran's report directly to you?
Actually, I'm not sure exactly what the on-paper report is. He is senior advisor to the director, but it is conceivable we can get that information. He might have reported through someone lower, like my deputy.
So your senior advisor did not report directly to you?
There are very few people who report directly to me.
Okay, Dr. Moran's testified that he could walk into your office anytime he wanted to. Is that true?
No, that's not true. You don't just walk into the office. I mean, he's there. I mean, it's conceivable that
Did he ever walk into your office?
I would say he did occasionally, but the idea, can I finish the answer to you, sir?
No, because I've got a lot of questions.
Okay.
Dr. Fauci, did you ever delete an official record?
No.
Dr. Fauci, did you ever conduct official business via email?
To the best of my recollection and knowledge, I have never conducted official business via my private email.
So there's a troubling pattern of behavior from your inner circle, not just Dr. Moran's, but also your chief of staff, Mr. Folkers. Do you agree that it violates NIAID policy to use personal email for official purposes?
The Dr. Moran's issue that was discussed by this committee violates NIH policy, yes.
But does using official email, using a personal email for official business, does that violate policy?
Using a personal email for official business violates NIH policy.
Does it violate NIAID policy to delete records to intentionally avoid FOIA?
Yes,
Okay. On April 28, 2020, Dr. Moran's edited an EcoHealth press release regarding the grant termination. Does that violate policy?
that was inappropriate for him to be doing that for a grantee as a conflict of interest, among other things.
So on March 29, 2021, Dr. Moran's edited a letter that Dr. Dasick was sending to NIH. Does that violate policy?
Yes, it does.
On October 25, 2021, Dr. Moran's provided Dr. Dasick with advice regarding how to mislead NIH on EcoHealth's late progress report. Does that violate policy?
That was wrong and inappropriate and violated policy.
On December 7, 2021, Dr. Moran's wrote to the chair of EcoHealth's board of directors to, quote, put in a word, end quote, for Dr. Dasick. Does that violate policy?
Should not have done that. That was wrong.
And that violates policy.
Well, I'm not sure of a specific policy, but I imagine it does violate policy. He should not have been doing that.
In addition to all those actions, Dr. Moran's wrote to Dr. Dasick, quote, Peter, from Tony's numerous recent comments to me, they are trying to protect you, end quote. Did you ever talk to Dr. Moran's about Dr. Dasick or EcoHealth Alliance?
I can tell you, regarding what you said, I never spoke about protecting him. I mean, obviously, we knew that Dasick was a grantee, so I may have mentioned and discussed Dr. Dasick because he's a grantee, but I never spoke about protecting
You're testifying
him.
that he just made that up.
Excuse me?
You're testifying that Dr. Moran's just made that up.
I don't know where he got that, but that's not true.
So by this point, Dr. Fauci, when these emails were written, you should have known that Dr. Dasick was more than 2 years late on a required progress report with his grant. Dr. Dasick conducted an experiment that resulted in a novel virus showing excess growth, that Dr. Dasick failed to report that experiment, that Dr. Dasick was protecting the Wuhan lab and not sharing its lab notebooks, and that Dr. Dasick failed to disclose obvious conflicts of interest. So why were you trying to protect Dr. Dasick and EcoHealth Alliance?
I repeat on the record, I have not tried to protect Dr. Dasick. And that's number one. Number two, you said something that's not true, because I did not know about the compliance issues until well after the fact when I was being briefed for going to before a congressional committee. So it wasn't as these things were going on, I knew that he was withholding.
Did you know about Dr. Moran's close relationship with Dr. Dasick?
Dr. Moran's made it clear that Dr. Dasick was his friend. I did not engage in any of that interaction between them.
Dr. Fauci, I want to join my colleague from Florida in apologizing to you that some of our colleagues in the United States House of Representatives seem to want to drag your name through the mud. They're treating you, Dr. Fauci, like a convicted felon. Actually, you probably wish they were treating you like a convicted felon. They treat convicted felons with love and admiration. Some of them blindly worship convicted felons. Is there anything else you would like to say to the American people about your service to America during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic?
My main job during the COVID pandemic was to play a role with my team at the Vaccine Research Center to develop a safe and effective vaccine. And we did that in an unprecedented short period of time, never seen before in the annals of vaccinology. As we all know, that vaccine and those vaccines have resulted in saving of hundreds of thousands of lives in the United States and millions of lives throughout the world.
You told Dr. Ruiz in his questioning that it was absolutely impossible for any of the viruses that you all were funding, I get that, it was impossible for SARS-CoV-2 or SARS-CoV-2, known as COVID-19, to have come from any of the work that was being done at Wuhan. At the same time, you told Mr. Comer that you didn't know about the noncompliance by EcoHealth until after the fact and when the virus is already out there, however it got there. In light of the fact that part of that noncompliance was a report where we uncovered, and I believe that Dr. Dashak was untruthful to this committee in one of his reports to NIAID, and further, that in the 2 most sensitive years related to the humanized mice experiments, we never got lab notebooks from Wuhan Institute of Virology. Can you understand, following the bouncing ball, why some of us doubt that, not that you had some hand in it or that you knew about it, but that doubt that you can state with certainty that it was impossible because they might have been doing stuff you didn't know about? Isn't that true?
Actually, it's not incompatible at all, Congressman, with what I said. The viruses that were studied, whether you did or did not give a 5-year report on time, were still the viruses that phylogenetically would be impossible to be the precursor of SARS-CoV-2. So it was completely compatible with the statement that I made to Dr. Ruiz.
Is that accurate as well, knowing that they had worked on adding a furin cleavage site to MERS?
But, sir, there's a difference between the viruses that were funded by the NIH subaward versus anything else anybody else in China might be doing.
Excellent.
We were talking about, did the NIH...
You were talking about what you funded.
What we funded, and
All right.
That's the point.
And that goes to my next question, because I thought you might go there, and I appreciate that.
Right.
Because in an off-the-record member-level briefing in February of 2022, I asked about the likelihood and nature of a SARS-related coronavirus to have a furin cleavage site, particularly since it takes the 12 nucleotide change in there to make it as viral as this was going on. And at the time, you said to me pretty much what you just said, and I want you to just confirm it for the record. Well, that wasn't us. If that was being done, it wasn't us. Yeah. And you confirmed that for the record, yes?
No,
it wasn't you. It wasn't what you were funding.
What I'm saying is that I cannot account, nor can anyone account, for other things that might be going on in China, which is the reason why I have always said, and will say now, I keep an open mind as to what the origin is. But the one thing I know for sure is that the viruses that were funded by the NIH phylogenetically could not be the precursor of SARS-CoV-2.
Does anything come top of mind right off the bat in how they cherry-picked parts of your 14-hour transcript?
I don't want to be casting stones at the distortions of what was said in that, but, you know, there are a couple of things that come to mind. You know, one I'm sure is going to come up later is the issue of the 6-foot distance, and I made the statement that it just appeared, and that got taken at like, I don't know what's going on, it just appeared. It actually came from the CDC. The CDC was responsible for those kinds of guidelines for schools, not me. So when I said that it just appeared, it appeared. Was there any science behind it? What I meant by no science behind it is that there wasn't a controlled trial that said, compare 6 foot with 3 feet with 10 feet. So there wasn't that scientific evaluation of it.
I just want to clarify for the record, because today you testified that you did not suppress the lab leak theory, yet in the past you have said, quote, it is a distortion of reality, unquote. You've said quote, "I've heard these conspiracy theories, and like all conspiracy theories, they're just conspiracy theories." That's what you told the American people. And so would you like to clarify what science were you following then versus now?
Yeah, no, I've also been very, very clear and said multiple times that I don't think the concept of there being a lab leak is inherently a conspiracy theory. What is conspiracy is the kind of distortions of that particular subject, like it was a lab leak and I was parachuted into the CIA like Jason Bourne and told the CIA that they should really not be talking about a lab leak.
Thank you.
That's the conspiracy.
Appreciate that. Dr. Fauci, how much have you earned from royalties from pharmaceutical companies since the pandemic began in 2021?
Zero.
It says NIH scientists made $710 million in royalties from drug makers. You're saying that you did not receive any of the $710 million.
On COVID, I received, I think, $122 for a monoclonal antibody that I made 27 years ago.
Okay, so just in general, though, how much have you received, not related to COVID, just in general, how much have you received in royalties between 2021 and 2023?
I think none.
Okay, so somebody received the $710 million.
Somebody did, but not me.
You didn't receive any royalties. Okay.
I mean, I see no royalties associated with COVID. I mentioned.
I said.
No, I want.
No, I just said.
I'm on the record, and I want to make sure that this is clear. That I've developed a monoclonal antibody about 25 years ago that's used as a diagnostic that has nothing to do with COVID, and I receive an average of about $120 a year from that
Okay,
patent.
but the bottom line here is that scientists at NIH did receive $710 million in royalties, and I guess my question is, don't you think that if these experiments are made using American tax dollars, that any of those royalties, this nearly billions of dollars, should be going back to the American taxpayer and not in the pockets of the scientists? Do you believe that's a law that we should consider changing?
If you want to change the patent laws and the Bayh-Dole Act, then go ahead.
Okay.
But that's not for me to
Well,
say.
I'm asking your opinion. Okay. Well, anyway, moving on, I just want to say that, we know billions of dollars have been funding these animal experiments, both here domestically and in foreign land. I'm very troubled by the cruel, horrific animal research that has been done on U.S. land and in foreign laboratories. Taxpayers are footing the bill for billions of dollars. These beagle puppies that have their throats slit, they are being injected with ticks, they are murdered after just a few months, piglets, rabbits, you name it. FDA is saying we no longer need to be testing human medications on animals, that there's other ways to achieve this. Can you comment on that, if it's time for the United States of America to be moving on from these cruel animal and horrific costly tests?
I'd be happy to comment, but I'm puzzled as to what that has to do with the origins of COVID.
Well, I have a question about it.
Okay,
and
I'd be
before
happy
this
to
committee,
answer.
and it has to do in general with
Yeah.
the amount of waste of tax dollars that NIH is using.
Well, the animal experiments that are conducted by and funded by NIH go through strict regulations of the proper use of animals in research. So I'm not, Congressman, with all due respect, I'm not trying to be confrontative. I'm not sure what you're talking about, but the experiments that the NIH funded go through strict regulatory processes of the treatment of animals, the humane treatment of animals.
Well, they're not very humane, and I will say, as the former director, you signed off on these experiments.
So, Dr. Fauci, can you please share with us the nature of the threats you have received since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, there have been everything from harassments by emails, texts, letters of myself, my wife, my 3 daughters. There have been credible death threats leading to the arrests of 2 individuals, and credible death threats mean someone who clearly was on their way to kill me. And it's required my having protective services essentially all the time. It is very troublesome to me. It is much more troublesome because they've involved my wife and my 3 daughters.
At these moments, how do you feel? Keep your mic on.
Terrible.
Dr. Fauci, did the National Institute of Health fund the potentially dangerous enhanced potential pandemic pathogens gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I would not characterize it the way you did. The National Institutes of Health, through a subaward to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, funded research on the surveillance of and the possibility of emerging infections. I would not characterize it as dangerous gain-of-function research. I've already testified to that effect a couple of times.
So you're saying no, correct? In his May 16,
I'm saying no because I've said no multiple times, including on the transcribed interview.
In his May 16, 2024 testimony, the NIH Deputy Director Tabak said, and I quote, "I can tell you that the failure of the Wuhan Institute of Virology to provide us with the data that we requested and the lab notebooks that we requested certainly impeded our ability to understand what was really going on with the experiments that we have been discussing this morning." My question to you, Dr. Fauci, if the NIH didn't inspect the Wuhan Institute of Virology and NIH didn't receive the lab books and data from China and the required reports from EcoHealth Alliance were not submitted, in fact, they were late, how can you definitively say that the NIH did not fund the dangerous gain-of-function research?
I go back to what I said, that the gain-of-function research by the operative and regulatory definition of P3CO does not include at all the viruses that were studied under the subaward.
How do you know that, sir, if there was no lab books, nothing from China?
We know what viruses they were studying.
How? How do you know? You never went there.
I'm telling you that the NIH funded research on these viruses. If someone else somewhere in China was doing something else,
well, and that's the problem, because NIH didn't go there. You didn't get the reports that were needed. How in the world would you know? I'm going to go on to the next question.
And you're not hearing what I'm saying.
The CDC Director Redfield testified that he was not invited on this conference call, and he believes because he believed the lab leak theory was possible. 3 days later, on February 4th, 2020, 4 participants on the conference call authored a paper, Proximal Origin, which was sent to you for editing. Proximal Origin pushed the natural origin theory. On April 16, 2020, the NIH director, Dr. Collins, emailed you expressing dismay that the Nature Medicine article, which was based on proximal origin, didn't suppress the lab leak theory, and asked you for more public pressure to suppress the lab leak theory. The very next day, in response to Dr. Collins' request to suppress the lab leak theory, you cited the Nature Medicine article, which discounted the lab leak theory from the White House podium. My question to you, sir, did you cite this article at the White House because the NIH director asked you to suppress the lab leak theory?
I did not do that in response to anybody's suggestion to suppress anything. It was in response to a question that someone asked at the podium. And I did not edit any paper as shown in my official testimony. So you said about 4 or 5 things, Congressman, that were just not true.
Well, we have emails to prove it.
Well, you don't.
Thank you, and I yield back.
To the gentlewoman from New York who wanted to argue that we should be worrying about testing of human medicines on animals, if this committee really wants to do something, let's talk about the most infamous biomedical research study in the United States, the Tuskegee study, where 400 black men in this country were injected deliberately with syphilis and allowed to die slowly over a 40-year period without any attempt to help them at all. It was condoned by the U.S. Public Health Service. And if we want to talk about testing, let's talk about that as well.
I'm going to go down a list of mitigation measures that you supported over the course of the pandemic and ask you just to give a yes or no as to whether you still believe these measures were justified. Business closures.
Not hearing you at all. Could you please speak louder into the microphone?
Sure. I'm going to go through a list of COVID mitigation measures that you supported over the course of the pandemic and ask you to give me a yes or no as to whether you believe these measures were justified. Business closures,
Early on, when 5,000 people were dying a day, yes.
church closures,
Same thing.
school closures,
Again,
stay-at-home orders.
these were important when we were trying to stop the tsunami of deaths that were occurring early on. How
Early
long
on.
you kept them going is debatable.
Mask mandates for adults, mask mandates for children, mask mandates for children under 5.
And going back to what I said before, all of that is in the context of, at the time, 4,000 to
Mask mandates for children
5,000
under
people a
5,
day
there's
were
scientific
dying.
evidence for that?
Excuse me?
Mask mandates for children under 5, there's scientific evidence supporting that?
There was no study that did masks on kids before. You couldn't do the study. You had to respond
Right.
to an epidemic that was killing 4,000 to 5,000 Americans per
Vaccine
day.
mandates for employees, vaccine mandates for students, vaccine mandates for military.
Vaccines save lives. It is very, very clear that vaccines have saved hundreds of thousands of Americans.
For example, you discussed both then and here with Congresswoman Castor the recommendation that we maintain 6 feet of distance between one another to reduce the spread of COVID-19. And you discussed how social distancing recommendations were developed, that you yourself didn't pick this 6 feet, and it was just really kind of a guideline in the moment. In your view, though, do social distancing recommendations and other public health measures to reduce transmission save lives?
Definitely.
Dr. Fauci, one of the controversial regulations of the pandemic was the 6-foot distancing rule. This rule became an important policy consideration in subsequent regulations. However, you testified recently, and I'm quoting, this 6-foot rule sort of just appeared. Do you think that a rule that sort of just appeared is substantial justification for the regulations that we saw based on that 6-foot rule?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I answered that, but I'll summarize it briefly for you. When saying it just appeared, it came from the CDC.
Okay, you stated that earlier. What was your relationship with the CDC when you saw a regulation which was not based in the current science?
Well, when I say was not based in science, I meant a prospective clinical trial to determine whether 6 foot was better than 3, was better than 10.
But once we realized that the virus was not spread by droplets and was aerosolized, did you feel an indication to go back to the CDC and said, let's base this on science. Let's get rid of this 6-foot rule. This 6-foot rule crippled businesses. It allowed students to stay at home and not learn. Americans suffered. And that suffering continues because the fracture of trust in American scientists continues to this day.
Mr. Fauci, you were quoted on CBS Face the Nation saying it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci?
I am a scientist who uses the scientific method to gain information.
Yes, you said you represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci? Yes
Again,
or no? Yes or no?
No, that's not a yes or no
Yes,
answer.
it's a yes or no.
I don't think it is.
Okay, well, we'll take that as a you don't know what you represent.
Oh,
But this, as director of the NIH, you did sign off on these so-called scientific experiments. And as a dog lover, I want to tell you this is disgusting and evil, what you signed off on, and these experiments that happened to beagles paid for by the American taxpayer. And I want you to know Americans don't pay their taxes for animals to be tortured like this. So the type of science that you are representing, Mr. Fauci, is abhorrent, and it needs to stop. Mr. Fauci, you also represent the type of science where you confess that you made up the COVID rules, including
I didn't hear what you
6
said.
feet social distancing and masking of children.
I never said I made anything up.
You admitted that you made it up. You
I
made it
didn't
up
say
as you went.
I made it up.
So are you saying this is fake news, Mr. Fauci?
I didn't say I made anything up.
What did you say?
I said that it is not based in science and it just appeared.
But this is science.
What does dogs have to do with anything that we're talking about today?
These are scientific experiments. This is what you signed off on. But you also told the American people they had to distance by 6 feet. They had to wear masks. But let's also talk a little bit further about the type of science that you represent. NIH scientists made $710 million in royalties from drug makers, a fact that's been hidden. Let's talk about the fact about, is it right for scientists and doctors getting paid by the American people, government taxpayer paychecks, to get patents where they're paid millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in royalty fees, especially when the NIH and these government agencies, most powerful agencies in our country, are recommending medical suggestions and advice and making up guidelines like 6 feet distancing and masking of children? Do you think that's appropriate? Do the American people deserve to be abused like that, Mr. Fauci? Because you're not doctor, you're Mr. Fauci in my few minutes. No, I don't need your answer. I want to talk about this right here.
Mr. Chairman,
Fauci,
objection.
I reclaim my
Mr. Chairman,
time.
objection.
I reclaim my time. I reclaim my time, Mr. Raskin.
Gentlelady will
Point of order.
suspend.
Mr. Chairman,
Point of order.
just in terms of the rules of decorum, are we allowed to deny that a doctor is a doctor just because we don't want him to be a doctor?
Yes, because in my time, that man does not deserve to have a license. As a matter of fact, it should be revoked, and he belongs in
Gentlelady will
prison.
suspend. The gentlelady should recognize the doctor as a doctor.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is this what we have become? Is this what we have devolved into? No decorum.
You know what? We can do that hearing about the poor men that were injected with syphilis, because I support you in that. That's horrific. And this government that does things like that to Americans doesn't have decorum to the American people.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman is out of
point of regular order, please.
The gentleman is out of order.
Decorum.
Recognize the point of order. Go ahead with your point of order.
You got it.
No, I mean, I was going to say what Representative Raskin said. That's completely unacceptable to be able to deny Dr. Fauci, who's here, a respected member of the medical community, his title, and that's actually a personal attack on his character.
And I have instructed her.
He's not respected.
And I've instructed her to address him as a doctor.
I'm not
Gentlelady
addressing
shall
him as
continue.
doctor. Let's talk about
Mr. Chairman,
this.
I
I'm
would
reclaiming
move that the
my
woman's
time. I'm reclaiming my time.
Words get taken
I'm
down.
reclaiming my time.
Second that.
Point of order.
Suspend.
All right.
A member can only move to have words. I'm sorry. The issues we are debating are important ones that members feel deeply about. And while vigorous disagreement is part of the legislative process, as I said at the beginning, members are reminded that we must adhere to established standards of decorum in debate. This is a reminder that it is a violation of House rules and the rules of this committee to engage in personalities regarding other members or to question the motives of a colleague. Remarks of that type are not permitted by the rules and are not in keeping with the best traditions of our committee. The chair will enforce these rules of decorum at all times and urges all members to be mindful of their remarks. Does the gentleman from California have anything further?
We should take her words down.
Yeah, I made it. I offered that her words be taken down, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a point of order.
Mr.
Because
Griffin
they
is
accused us
Mr.
of
Griffin is-
worshiping
Gentlelady
President
will-
Trump. We don't
Gentlelady-
worship President Trump.
Gentlelady will suspend. Mr. Griffin, you have a point of order.
Mr. Chairman, while it may not be polite, I believe the rule only applies to members of this body, the Senate, and the President of the United States. I do not believe that it applies. The rule on taking down words does not apply to a witness. Again, I'm not condoning the words. I'm just relating or asking whether or not it applies to individuals who are just happen to be here in front of us.
I agree. The chair overrules the point of order by the gentleman from Maryland, but asks that members please afford all other members the respect they're entitled, refrain from using rhetoric that could be construed as an attack on the motives or character of another member or the witness. You may proceed.
Thank you. This was a time in history where you got to throw out the first pitch at the Washington Nationals baseball game, while Americans were forced to stay home and watch such events that they love from at home alone on their televisions. And what a hypocrisy this picture shows. Here you are without your mask, with empty seats everywhere. Remember the cardboard cutout fans? That was one of the most insulting things to Americans, having to watch the games from home, where you got to go and enjoy the game and sit right next to people not following the 6 feet of distancing, not wearing your mask, and everyone else was forced to stay home and stop enjoying life. And your science here, your science is displayed perfectly in this picture, where children in school were put in plastic bubbles because of your science, your repulsive, evil science. And let's go back to your very own email. You said earlier you don't use email. Oh, you do. Right here. This is your own email where you said the typical mask you buy in the drugstore is not really effective in keeping out virus. I do not recommend that you wear a mask. This is your email. This is your own words. But yet children all over America were forced to wear masks. Healthy children forced to wear masks, muzzled in their schools. And then they were forced to learn from home because of your so-called science and your medical suggestions, while you and all your cronies get paid from Big Pharma. You know that what this committee should be doing? We should be recommending you to be prosecuted. We should be writing a criminal referral because you should be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. You belong in prison, Dr. Fauci.
I was mayor during the time of the pandemic. I remember how painful it was to close businesses, to shut down schools, but how quickly we forget the pain and how scared we were as a country. We were washing our groceries as they were coming in. We were keeping seniors at a distance. The tragedy that was happening in our nursing homes. Thousands of people were dying a day, and you and your team of the best and the brightest scientists in this country and the world were doing everything that you could and working night and day to save more and more of those lives.
Apparently, you neglected to surround yourself with equally smart individuals. Dr. Morans wrote to another collaborator, Peter Hotitz, in June 2021, at Baylor College of Medicine, that he had deleted all his emails related to COVID origin when, quote, the shit hit the fan, end quote. He said, quote, I feel pretty sure Tony were too. The best way to avoid FOIA hassles is to delete all emails when you learn the subject is pretty sensitive. In October 2021, Dr. Morans wrote to Peter Daszak, quote, Peter, from Tony's numerous recent comments to me and from what Francis has been vocal about over the past 5 years, we are trying to protect you, and they are protecting their own reputations as well, end quote. I'll just jump ahead. The American people can rest assured that we are going to continue to pursue answers, and we continue to push for full accountability from you and your colleagues despite continuing efforts to try to cover this up. Dr. Fauci, history will not be kind to you, and you will be known as the man who put his personal interests before the interest of the American people, the very people that you were supposed to be protecting. Your actions, along with several others we have had before this committee, have completely eroded America's trust in our public health system and the agency that you represented for half a century. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. And now
To use my time to dispel some of the myths about you that have circulated in right-wing circles, we can all acknowledge that, yes, suspension of in-person activities during the early days of COVID, it was necessary to save lives and to stop the spread, and it was not without its challenges. It was difficult, particularly for our nation's students, like my two sons in public schools and our business owners. But to completely blame these policies on you, Dr. Fauci, is absolutely ridiculous.
It's been insinuated that politicians, only bloggers, only conspiracy theorists are disagreeing with you. I want to point out that I'm probably the only member of Congress that actually treated patients during the pandemic from the very beginning to the very end of the pandemic, during night shifts in the ER. Thousands of patients during that time. And in 2020, I was censored. My medical license was threatened because I disagreed with bureaucrats. Literally taken off the internet as a person who is treating patients with leading-edge technologies, developing theories, but doing my very best, but being censored by the United States government for the first time, stepping in and taking the place of medical professionals as the experts in healthcare. Any dissent surrounding COVID-19 treatments, mask mandates, and any public policy surrounding the pandemic was immediately labeled as anti-science. I watched as public health officials and politicians told my patients what treatment options were best for them, regardless of their comorbidities or their medical history. Despite my education and my training and my experience, my opinions were relegated to conspiracy and misinformation by so-called healthcare experts who had never treated a patient throughout the entire pandemic. This has been a black eye on the medicine and has highlighted why government should never insert itself in between patients and their healthcare providers. The American people deserve to make medical decisions through conversations with their physicians rather than politically motivated mandates. Dr. Fauci, did you ever treat a patient for COVID during the pandemic?
I was part of a team that was at the NIH that took care. We didn't take care of many of them.
Okay, so not hands-on. Got it. Thank you. Why would I be criticized by a bureaucrat for doing my very best as a healthcare? This is a rhetorical question. But why? Why would the government, who's never treated a patient for COVID, you can read all the things you want, but you're not there. You're not seeing patients. You're not watching people die, intubating patients right there with that disease in your face, watching it happen, watching the development of this disease and actually learning from it. But I'm being told by bureaucrats what's right and wrong. And what's funny is everything I was censored on, I was proven to be right. Pretty crazy, isn't it? You said in an interview that you gave as part of an audiobook written by Michael Spector that you believed an institutional should make it hard for people to live their lives so they'd feel pressured to get vaccinated. Could we run the audio clip on that, please?
You think can be done about it? I have to say that I don't see a big solution other than some sort of mandatory vaccination. I know federal officials don't like to use that term.
Once people feel empowered and protected legally, you are going to have schools, universities, and colleges are going to say, you want to come to this college, buddy? You're going to get vaccinated. Lady, you're going to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
Big corporations like Amazon and Facebook and all of those others are going to say, you want to work for us, you get vaccinated. And it's been proven that when you make it difficult for people in their lives, they lose their ideological bullshit and they get vaccinated.
Thank you. Are all objections to COVID vaccinations ideological bullshit, Dr. Fauci?
No, they're not, and
Thank
that's
you.
not what I was referring to.
Well, in reference to making it hard for people to get education, traveling, working, I'd say it very much was in context. And I take great offense to this. Miss Allison Williams testified before this committee about losing her job because she sought an exemption for ESPN's vaccine mandate, which came from recommendations from bureaucrats like yourself. She and her husband were actively working with a fertility expert, a physician, on how to get pregnant, and agreed with the premise that she was young, healthy, wanted to get pregnant, and shouldn't get the vaccination for medical purposes. But she was fired because you made it hard, just like you said in your statement, because you didn't want to make sure that the ideological bullshit got in the way of her working, of living her life, of making a medical decision with her healthcare professional. I think America should take great offense to this. That's exactly what you meant when you said making it hard for people to live without getting a vaccination. You affected people's ability to work, travel, be educated, to actually flourish in American society, to self-determine, as we're all given God-given rights. Shame on you. Dr. Fauci, you've become Dr. Fear. Americans do not hate science. I don't hate science. The American people hate having their freedoms taken from them. You inspired and created fear through mass mandates, school closures, vaccine mandates that have destroyed the American people's trust in our public health institutions. This fear you created will continue to have ripple effects over generations to come. You have already seen its effects in education, in the economy, and everything else. Quite frankly, you said, if you disagree with me, you disagree with science. Dr. Fauci, I disagree with you because I disagree with fear.
I was not here, but I saw a member of this committee questioned whether or not you represent science and tried to make that in some offensive way. I just want you to know most Americans don't think she represents Congress.
So one of the things I've learned
So I hear now you double Fauci. So I don't want you to be offended by that.
Doctor, why was it so important that the virus not have started in a lab?
We don't know where it started, and that's the reason why I keep an open mind. So I don't know what you mean by why was it so important. It wasn't important.
You still don't know where it started? The guys you gave money to figured it out in 3 days.
No.
Mr. Anderson said on January 31st, 2020, virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. The very next day, Dr. Gary said, I don't know how this happens in nature. It'd be easy to do in a lab. And then 3 days later, Shazam, they switch and say it has to be nature. So they figured it out in 3 days, but you still don't know?
No, in fact, if you look at what they were saying, Congressman Jordan, they were saying that it was not a manufactured virus. It still could have evolved out of a lab.
Well, let me read something here to you.
They're not incompatible.
In our study on the censorship of the Biden administration working with big tech, I want to read you a WhatsApp message from Mark Zuckerberg. Can we include that the White House put pressure on us to censor the lab leak theory? So this is a communication on July 16th, 2021. Nick Clegg, Joel Kaplan, Sheryl Sandberg, Mark Zuckerberg. They're certainly feeling the pressure to downplay any lab leak theory and go with the natural origin theory.
Is there a question there?
One's coming. Here's another email to Mark Zuckerberg. It says, subject line, COVID misinformation, Wuhan lab leak theory. In response to continued public pressure and tense conversations with the new administration, we started removing 5 COVID claims, including the lab leak theory. Mr. Zuckerberg responds, this seems like a good reminder that when we compromise our standards due to pressure from an administration in either direction, we often later regret it. Why was it so important the virus not have started in a lab?
Wasn't so important that the virus not. We don't know. We know
it was important to someone in the Biden administration, so much so that the top people at Meta, the top people at Facebook are asking, why are we getting all this pressure to downplay the lab leak theory? And we have an email from June of the same year, June 4th, 2021, saying the same thing. It was certainly important to somebody.
Well, what has that got to do with me?
I'm asking you because you're the expert on the coronavirus. I'm saying why was the administration so pushing not to have the lab leak theory as something that was viable?
I can answer that. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
You kept an open mind. Dr. Fauci, open mind.
That is correct.
What happened in those 3 days? Why did Dr. Anderson and Mr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, why did they change their mind in 180 degrees? Because what Christian Anderson says 3 days later, after he said virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory, 3 days later he says the main crackpot theories going around at the moment relate to this virus being somehow engineered, and that is demonstrably false. How did they figure all that out in 3 days, Dr. Fauci?
You can do that.
You still have an open mind.
Well, what they did is that they testified before this committee. What they did, they went back and looked at the sequences and realized that their initial concern was unfounded about that, and it did not look at all like it was manufactured. But as they said in their paper, even though they feel it was more likely—
3 days, they figured it out.
That's exactly. You could do that in 3 days. You can scan sequences in a day. You don't need 3 days.
Okay, who's Robert Redfield?
The former director of the CDC.
Dr. Redfield, right? And he was also on the coronavirus task force. Is that accurate?
He was a member of the coronavirus task force.
And here's what he said to this committee. He said, Redfield said that Fauci and Collins left him out because Redfield suspected that coronavirus had leaked from the Chinese lab. Is that accurate?
Well, he said that, but that's not true. That is incorrect, Congressman.
Dr. Redfield's lying to the committee when he sat right where you sat?
When he said that I kept him out, that is an incorrect statement. The roster who was on the phone
was Dr. Redfield in that conference call on February 1st when you had Mr. Anderson and Dr. Gary on that call?
He was not. And the conference call was put together by Jeremy Farrar. So no one kept him out. He said he was kept out because he felt—
Did U.S. tax dollars—
You want me to answer the question?
Yeah, I would just wonder why he wasn't on the call. It seems to me the head of CDC, part of the coronavirus task force, which was formed 2 days prior to that call, would have been on the call.
Well, the call was arranged by Jeremy Farrar. You should ask him.
Okay. Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
I'm sorry, what was—
Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
Yes, of course. It was a sub-award to the Wuhan Institute.
And who approved that award?
Excuse me?
And who approved that award? What agency approved that award?
National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
Your agency approved that, right?
Yes, it did after.
Did that have anything to do with this downplaying of the lab leak theory?
No.
Nothing to do with it?
Nothing.
What, do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Wow.
I think most of the country would find that amazing. I still got 11 seconds.
But look at the facts.
The issue of the CIA trip was brought up. That was brought to us by a whistleblower. That was not an allegation made by the committee. It was an allegation made by the whistleblower. You testified at a transcribed interview back in early January. Do you recall me asking you about that allegation?
About the going to the CIA?
Yes. And do you recall, and you denied it then as well, and you denied it here today, do you recall the subcommittee publishing that you denied it?
I don't recall.
We did.
You did, okay.
We put it out in a press release afterwards that you denied the whistleblower's allegation. And then today, during the course of the last couple hours, have any members on the majority side of the dais asked you about a trip to the CIA?
Yeah.
They have?
No,
side?
they have. I'm sorry, Mitch, I'm not hearing this so well.
I have a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
What's the gentleman's point of order?
I have an inquiry about whether or not I'm hearing things or whether or not you just yielded 30 minutes of committee time to staff.
That is correct, both sides.
And the question that the gentleman just raised was a question that I raised. So apparently he was not listening when I was questioning Dr. Fauci.
Thank you for your point of order. You may continue.
What I asked was, we asked you about this in a transcribed interview. You testified that you did not go to the CIA. We published that you refuted that allegation. And then today, no members of the Republican side of the dais have asked you that question. Is that accurate? Thank you. Dr. Francis Collins, the former NIH director, recently said in an interview, and I'm quoting, you attach an infinite value to stopping the disease and saving a life. You attach a zero value to whether this actually totally disrupts people's lives, ruins the economy, and has kept many kids out of school in a way that they never quite recovered. Understanding the COVID task force had a lot of voices at the table, is that an accurate description of the public health advisors, and then you could fit in other advisors along the way?
Yeah, you know, Mitch, what I believe that Dr. Collins was saying was that we give advice based on pure public health issues. It's very, very clear now, retrospectively, looking at the potential collateral negative effects of things like mandating. It would be important for us now, since the purpose of, I believe, why we're here, is to how we can do better next time, is to consider the balance.
Could issuing these mandates and removing the notion of informed consent from some certain sects of the citizenry lead to vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah, I mentioned this, I believe, in the TI, that as a matter of fact, that's something that I think we need to go back now when we do an after the event evaluation about whether or not, given the psyche of the country and the pushback that you get from those types of things, we need to reevaluate the cost-benefit ratio of those types of things.
Is it possible, if not plausible, that EcoHealth and the Wuhan Institute of Virology have samples from between 2020 when they originally published a paper, or excuse me, 2015 when they originally published a paper with all of their samples, and now that are unpublished?
Sure, it's possible, but Mitch, I might just throw in there, you can't get away from the fact that the viruses that were studied, that the NIH gave them a grant to study, don't pull back on the fact that no matter what you did with those viruses, they were phylogenetically so different, they could not possibly be the precursor of SARS-CoV-2.
And I agree with that. I guess my only point is that you don't know all the viruses they were working with.
Yeah, and let's make that clear, because Congressman Griffith asked it, and I answered you quite honestly, that none of us can know everything that's going on in China or in Wuhan or what have you. And that's the reason why I say today, and I've said at the TI, I keep an open mind as to what the origin is.
Prior to October of 2021, the NIH website listed gain of function as a type of research that modifies a biological agent so that it confers new or enhanced activity to that agent. And the P3CO framework that the U.S. government uses to further regulate a subpart of that research that is more dangerous, specifically that could cause widespread and uncontrolled death or disease in humans. Putting aside what's regulatory, I agree with you, the P3CO definition is regulatory. Are there types of research that could fall under the broad definition but not the P3CO definition?
Well, I believe members on the minority side have mentioned that. Influenza is a gain of function to a virus to make it grow better in eggs. Making an E. coli manufacture insulin is telling the E. coli to do something it wasn't able to do before by mutations. Of course that's the case.
So in kind of the Venn diagram of this research, something could fall under gain of function without falling under further regulation.
I know where you're going and you're not going to get there, but go ahead.
According to EcoHealth's Year 5 progress report, they facilitated an experiment in Wuhan that had 7 mice infected with Wuhan Institute of Virology 1 as the backbone, 5 survived. Then 8 mice were infected with a chimera of WIV1 and the spike from another virus, and 2 survived. In EcoHealth's own words, these results suggest that the pathogenicity of that full-length chimera is higher than others.
Right.
You were asked today, and it was read back to you a little bit, but on May 16th, just a few weeks ago, Ms. Lesko asked Dr. Tabak, did NIH fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth? And Dr. Tabak answered, if you're speaking about the generic term, yes, we did.
Right.
On May 11th, you were asked a similar question, and you answered the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I'm going to ask it, and you can answer it how you want to answer it. According to the broad definition of gain-of-function research and the definition Dr. Tabak was testifying pursuant to, did NIAID fund gain-of-function research via EcoHealth in Wuhan?
The broad definition of gain of function, in my mind, is not applicable here and does nothing but confuse the situation.
If there's no further business, without objection, the Select Subcommittee stands adjourned.